College Football Nerds here talking top 10. We are masochists, so we are trying to figure out a way to do it in this landscape. It's weird, y'all, doing a top 10 this time of year without Big Ten and Pac-12 and all the COVID crazy. But we're going to do it. And last week, I want to kind of give a thanks to y'all. Some of y'all gave us your top 10s in the comments. Do it again this week. And while you're down there, like it's right above the comment section. There's a subscribe button. Hit that. Helps us out. What we're going to do, Josh and I were talking before this segment, and I reeled off my top 6, or my top 10, and my first 6 were the same as his first 6, and that's kind of boring. So we're going to go 1 to 10. We're going to go ahead and flash these top 6 and kind of talk about this group and then get into the more interesting stuff, where we differ, why teams aren't in the top 10, why we left teams out, and all that. So for these 6, we got Clemson, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Notre Dame, and Tennessee. And Josh, for me, it's really tricky after that. It's kind of tricky within that because, as we said last week, we ain't got no Big Ten. We ain't got no Pac-12. Some people are ranking them. Some people aren't. It's made for a real kludgy top 10. Because if you've got somebody that leaves Ohio State off their ballot because they're not doing Big Ten teams, and then you've got someone that's got them number 2, then it affects their overall ranking. Right now, we got Penn State sitting at 9, and we were talking about it before the show, and I want you to just unpack it a little bit, why this is a problem. Go ahead with it, and then we'll get into maybe our top 6 after that.
Right. And we mentioned this last week and where the rankings were, and it came out right as we're recording. Always usually does. We didn't even know like how many people didn't vote for Ohio State. So the first point is having like Ohio State at 6 is just pointlessly stupid because either you believe they're a top 3 team or top 4 team and you include them, or you shouldn't include them. 6 is just not where they are. I think everybody agrees with that. But the bigger problem to me with Ohio State and Penn State right now is they haven't played any games, and you're comparing them against teams that have. And so, when you look at the undefeated teams, it makes sense, but you got to look at the 1 or 2 lost teams. And you go, wait, that's not fair. You don't know that Ohio State or Penn State would have lost. Actually, I do, because Ohio State plays Penn State in week 2. So I guarantee you, if these 2 teams had played 2 games, one of them would have lost. And if you're a Ohio State fan, you're probably listening going, yeah, I think we're going to beat Penn State. Well, if you had beaten Penn State in week 2 this past week, you started the same time as the SEC, I guarantee you they would not be at number 9. The problem is the way this is being done, it's actually, everybody in the Big Ten's kind of being hampered on one end because people aren't being ranked at all. But where the people are actually ranking them when they do rank them, quite frankly, on average, it's too high. Because what we've seen is a lot of craziness, first off, where teams are losing to teams they absolutely shouldn't, like LSU losing to Mississippi State. We pretty much were straight out there. Like we didn't put Mississippi State super highly in our rankings, and I basically said I had no intention of even considering it. Didn't buy that they were a good team. We just knew LSU came out completely flat, unprepared, etc. That's COVID. People are going to lose games they shouldn't lose. The Big Ten teams are kind of being all assumed they wouldn't have lost yet to one of those crazy games. And that absolutely would have happened to like a Wisconsin, Minnesota, Penn State. Somebody's going to lose a crazy game early. But at the very least, we just want to make the point. Ohio State and Penn State do play in the first 2 weeks of the season. So having them both as top 10 teams in a group of all undefeateds, quite frankly, doesn't make a lot of sense from a where they should be at this point in the year perspective.
And for me, it's a little more about the other teams that are going to lose, the rust teams. And it's not realistic to think that you're not going to have a weird result, a rust game. Like it's happened in every other conference. We talked about before, like Alabama's the only undefeated team in the SEC West. It's week 2. Like, we've just played 2 games. So, for me, those rust games are going to happen. And part of it is because you're just playing a short conference schedule and you have to get in it real fast. You don't get the warm-up games. You don't get the tune-up games. So, that's going to happen. So that's our piece on Big Ten, Pac-12. We will rank them once they start playing. For now, they're out, and it just makes sense because right now we've got a little mix of both, and it's the worst of both worlds. So we'll get there when we get there. In our top 6, especially with games this weekend, look, I don't think Alabama's going to. We didn't even do a preview for Alabama Ole Miss. I don't think there any real danger there, but I want to see if that defense can show a championship caliber. We feel like they've made a step from where they were in 18 and 19. I want to see if they're a championship defense or if they're going to need to beat somebody 47-44 and then have real concerns. Similar with Clemson, you talked about how you don't necessarily think Miami's going to win this game or really challenge them, but you want to see if Clemson is the Clemson we need them to be a playoff contender, or if there's some either rust or things of concern. Talk about the rest of the 6 a little bit before we get into our 7. Florida, Georgia, Notre Dame, Tennessee. Kind of hit those with the high notes, and then we'll get into our more interesting discussion.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff here in terms of matchups. One note, we both actually have Tennessee 6. And Tennessee's climbed up the rankings. I think they're climbing up a little too slow, given where everybody else is nationally right now. Tennessee's a good team. And in the AP poll, they have Auburn ahead of Tennessee. Auburn 13, Tennessee 14. Auburn's lost and looked worse losing than Tennessee has. And yeah, they played a close game against South Carolina, but Tennessee statistically was really the far better team in that game. Now, I know they're inconsistent. I'm not sure how much that's going to keep playing. They certainly looked a lot better than Missouri. And I can't see you say that out of Auburn, but I think it's interesting that we've got them at 4 and 6, and they do actually play each other. I think that's a grossly underrated game this week if you're looking for something to watch. Florida is playing Texas A&M, and we're kind of different opinions on A&M, and we'll probably get into that a little later. But it's going to be interesting to see where Florida shakes out, because I'm still not 100% sold on their defense and their line play, which has been a problem. Notre Dame kind of sits there at 5. I think they're quietly one of the more complete teams in the country. They haven't played many games. I don't know how challenged they're going to be in the ACC. I'll go ahead and, newsflash, you watch our preview. We're actually really high on Miami. The problem is Clemson's Clemson, and we get into that in our preview video, but Miami, Notre Dame, and Clemson are all really good and be competitive in any conference. The rest of the ACC would not, and I don't think that's going to shock anybody here. Notre Dame, though, I think would be competitive. It's going to be hard really throughout the season to get clarity on it until they play Clemson.
All right, so go ahead and give me your number 7 so I can make fun of you on behalf of Ohio State fans. This is kind of an inside multi-year running joke, but we'll talk about it. But go ahead and give me your number 7.
My number 7 is Texas A&M. Are you done laughing yet?
I am. Unpack that.
So, look, y'all. I know Texas A&M does not have many great wins on the resume the past few years. I know everybody made fun of us last year because we kept saying Texas A&M, and they did, if it was either they or South Carolina had the hardest schedule in the past 20 years, if ever. They were incredibly difficult. I think A&M ended up playing number 1, I think it was 4 times in the same season, because they kept playing a team right before they lost and they'd lose the ranking, and then they played like Alabama, and they play Alabama and they they lose that game, and then they play Clemson, and then Alabama jumped them, and then they played Alabama lose. It was crazy.
LSU, Georgia,
all these teams. Yeah, they were all taking the ranking right before they played A&M. I think A&M is a better team than they were last year. That's the short version of it. There are not a lot of complete teams, and again, we're not including Big Ten teams. So I will be very clear: A&M would drop. I have Big Ten teams I'd probably put in front of them, at least very clearly, at least Ohio State. I'm not going to even guess on the rest, but they are better than last year. They have one of the best offensive lines probably in the country. They have a very good defensive line. I'm a little questionable in the back 7. We get in that on our preview defensively, but they also have pretty good skill talent offensively. I think they're a good complete team. And as we'll get into later, my big thing is I think they could be competitive with Florida, and you can look at our preview to think exactly how I feel about that one. But if you're saying that, then I think it's fair to have them top 10 and even number 7, given who I would have behind them. And I'm just not going to penalize anybody that much. And we talk about this all the time. If you lose to number 1 or number 2 or number 3, and we think they're a truly ultra elite team, and we think there is a big gap after Clemson and Alabama, I don't blame you if you lose even badly to those teams, because I think most on this list would.
Yeah, and to your point, the criticism we got last year was we said if App State is good enough to be ranked and they barely beat South Carolina, A&M murdered South Carolina, you're telling me A&M shouldn't be ranked 25 because they couldn't beat Clemson or Alabama or LSU or Georgia. That, to me, that's ridiculous. I mean, you shouldn't be. The bar is not you got to beat number 2 to be number 25. That's ridiculous. Anyway, I also think it's ridiculous to put them in the top 10 because right now what you're doing is you're having to look at a lot of benefit of the doubt. Because we got we got A&M Vandy a 17-12 score. LSU just murdered Vandy, and LSU's not great this year. And then we got Alabama just dragging their brains up and down the field, at least offensively, in that game. So the result we have of a team that we're putting, and this is how wild 2020 is, a team that a mostly sane person in Josh is putting at number 7 is 1-1 with a 5-point win over Vandy and a blowout loss to Alabama. That's crazy to me, and it's crazy that it's not that crazy. Really, I've got Miami at number 7, and based on what you said, we did a Miami Clemson preview. Based on what you said, I don't think you think Miami at 7 is that far out of line. Talk about that a little bit.
I don't, and I'll give you a hint. I actually have Miami in my top 10. I think Miami at 7 makes a lot of sense. I think Miami's a good team. I'll elaborate. I guess we'll uncover it in a minute. Look, they've got a good quarterback in Derek King. They've got a good offense. I think they're still a little vertically challenged, so to speak, offensively. I think decent. They are a good defensive team all around. They're not quite cohesive. They haven't played as well or as consistently as they should have on defense, and I've seen a little too much stuff like Jalen Phillips going to the sideline looking mad because he hasn't quite been able to produce as well as he had or made a penalty or something. And that's kind of why they're held back a little bit in my mind, but they're still a really good team. And I totally agree with you. I mean, it's a little bit crazy to have A&M even under our metrics, but the fair thing I would say is I could see Miami having the same kind of struggles with Vanderbilt, and I don't care that much if you have a close win over a team due to weird stuff. Like, I'm not just ranking you based off total scores, but more just general performance. And they really outplayed Vanderbilt, and they had 9 possessions. They fumbled 4 away, and they scored 3 of the 5 times they actually had the ball. So, and again, I think Miami would lose just as badly as Alabama, frankly. So that's I don't mind flipping them, but I just kind of have it the way I do for, we'll see next week. It's going to tell us whether I'm crazier.
So I have one next that you can maybe do to me what I did to you for your A&M. I have Cincy at 8. I like the fact that they've won. And I was looking, I didn't watch the Cincy South Florida game, but Cincinnati won, I think 28-7 or something like that, which we give credit for teams handling their business. But, I want you to kind of talk about this because you had a fair point when looking at how bad South Florida was and that maybe they didn't handle their business enough. I'm sticking with Cincy at 8, but tell me why Cincinnati 8 may not be a good pick.
Yeah, and again, I said I don't really necessarily care about score per se, but just sort of general performance. I mean, 28-7, it was 14-0 at the half. Notre Dame beat them 52-0. South Florida is a bad team. And it's one thing to say it was 28-7 and they put it away really in the third quarter, excuse me. You got to get in the stats a little bit on that one. Riddler for Cincinnati, 5.5 yards per attempt. He only threw for 140 yards in the game. Cincinnati didn't even run the ball well. None of the backs averaged 5 yards per carry. Well, I guess Riddler had 28 yards on 4 carries. Dokes had 100 yards rushing, but just at that mark, and it took over 20 carries to get there. You should be murdering South Florida if you're a good team. And, uh, you know, like for a top 10 mark, I just don't see it. I mean, I just don't see Cincy, if you're having those kind of struggles. Again, 14-point win in Army. If they were playing real teams, Alabama's, or even like Vandy, you can laugh at Vandy. Vandy is still a lot better than South Florida. I don't think they would have been any better than 17-12, and I think they would have gotten run out of the stadium by Alabama. So I personally, I don't have Cincy in my list, and I just don't think they're that good.
All right, give me your number 8, and then let me tell you why it's wrong.
Okay, and I'll add one thing. Let me tell you about this massive hypocrisy. I had Cincy in my top 10 last week. But, my defense, I was defending Cincy over UCF fans that asked why I didn't have UCF. And I basically said everything I just said about Cincy with the UCF schedule. That proved right, and now I'm going to realize I was completely wrong last week with Cincy. Anyway, number 8, Oklahoma State. To me, Oklahoma State's the quiet one nationally. Oklahoma and Texas, we'll probably talk about them. We're going to talk about a lot of teams that dropped out of the top 10 or didn't make our list after done with the top 10. That'll be the more fun discussion, so stick around. But Oklahoma State, very quietly, is handling business. They're handling it pretty well. I mean, Oklahoma State, Kansas 47-7. That was a drubbing. They beat West Virginia, and it was only a 14-point win, quote, only. But one, that looks a lot better in retrospect because West Virginia beat a Baylor team that's supposed to be pretty good. 2, their first win was a struggle win over Tulsa, but Tulsa just turned around and beat somebody, right? So, between those 2 games, I don't think a close win over West Virginia is problematic. Tulsa just beat UCF, and you handled business against Kansas. Given everybody else that's out there at 3-0, that's a solid resume, and they seem to be playing good football. So I think Oklahoma State's pretty justifiable at 8.
Yeah, I don't have a huge problem with that. I've got them at 9. Oklahoma State took the initial perception ding because they didn't blow out Tulsa. Tulsa may not be a bad team. We don't think UCF is great this year, and I'm going to stick by that, and I think it was proven out this weekend, but Tulsa still beat them. They're still competent. They're better than their name brand, I guess I should say. And for all of the weirdness that has happened this year, especially in the Big 12, for all the weirdness that has happened, Oklahoma State is still undefeated. And to me, like, Kansas is going to beat somebody they're not supposed to this year. They just will, and Oklahoma State just drubbed them. So I have much appreciation for teams that can keep a clean win-loss record this year more than any other year, even playing inferior opponents, just because of how much nuttiness we've seen this season. Give me your number 9.
My number 9 is Miami. And again, if you want to say I'm crazy and they should be ahead of A&M, that's fine. If you think they should be ahead of Tennessee, that's fine too. I can't really argue with it too strongly. But given our metric, which is kind of, would you have done any better against the teams those teams played? I think Miami is a good team. I think, is this fair to say? Like, I see Miami as kind of the inverse of Tennessee. Like, I think, especially in the offensive side of the ball, there's not a ton of explosiveness there. I mean, Eric King, as much as he's an exciting, explosive player, quote unquote, his explosiveness just brings good results out of bad plays that creates consistency. Like, he gets you an 8-yard play when it should be blown up. And yeah, he made some explosive plays against Florida State. That's a different issue. I just, with Miami, I'm concerned about the offensive line still. I think the defensive line is really patched up with the transfers again, but it's just not a whole lot more than that. Whereas Tennessee, to me, has a lot of real flash, but without the consistency that Miami has.
Tennessee's going to win on both lines of scrimmage, and Miami, if they win a game, it's going to be because of skill players. I think that's fair. And explosiveness from the defensive line, being able to put real pressure on the quarterback, where Tennessee is more of a boa constrictor type of defense. All right, number 10 is BYU. I'm going to defend this first, and you can maybe pick it apart if you want. Like I said about Oklahoma State, in an era of people losing to teams like, look what Iowa State did week 1. Look what Kansas State did week 1. In a year where teams are losing to teams they shouldn't, and there's so much nuttiness going on, I get that BYU hasn't played anybody yet. And that's a criticism we've levied at Central Florida in the past and other G5 teams. The difference is they've murdered all 3 of their opponents. Like, just straight up murdered them. And for that, at least for now, I appreciate that. I put that a little higher than an A&M who struggled with Vanderbilt and got killed by Alabama. Any thoughts on BYU at 10? Why or why not? That's wild.
I don't have a problem with it, and I thought about it. My concern with BYU, look, it's one thing to say you haven't played good teams, and it's another thing to say you've played really bad teams. And quite frankly, BYU is in the latter camp. Navy to open the season, that's widely publicized, right? Navy was not prepared to play football, period. They're not a good team this year, and they were just not ready to play, especially in a triple option offense, which you have to practice the crap out of that to be able to be effective. But then when you look at the other opponents, I mean, they played Troy, who they beat up on Middle Tennessee State, who in recent years has been really bad. And that's the only game Troy's played. So we don't know anything about them really. And then Louisiana Tech, they ended up pulling away and blowing out an FCS team. And then they beat Southern Miss, who's the worst Southern Miss team in decades, by 1. Most teams would be 3-0 with BYU's schedule. That's going to be BYU's problem all year, I'll say. And incredibly as it is to say, it's not really going to get much harder than it already has. I mean, UAB is supposedly looks like a pretty good team this year. I'll say they're solid. And that's about the best you're going to have. So evaluating BYU is going to be a nightmare. I don't have a problem with it, but that's what they are. And I'll move on to my number 10. And it's the other complete opposite end of the spectrum for the rationale you just talked about. My number 10 is LSU. They're 1-1. They lost a game to Mississippi State. I don't think Mississippi State is a great team. Mississippi State turned around and lost to Arkansas. They looked horrendous at it. LSU lost that game without Stingley. And they ended up playing an emergency reserve corner who was coming off knee surgery. Obviously, they weren't prepared schematically for that game. There's a lot of talk about how LSU, and I've heard this from a number of sources, is not a team that's ready to play football this year. They've had a lot of stuff going on in the locker room. They had guys opt out that opted back in. A lot of guys aren't in shape. So I get why you could say it's crazy to have them 10. But at the same time, they turned around and absolutely handled business against Vandy, and you got to give credit for that. I mean, A&M won 17-12, and LSU just ran them up and down the field. And in that game, it was really obvious that LSU is one of the most talented teams in the country. And as much as the Mississippi State game was a disaster, they still hung with them for most of that game. They still looked pretty good offensively, even if they've got some issues in the passing game. And I'm not sure, again, at this point down, and we're about to start this conversation, everybody's got some stupid loss. And LSU had a good win, at least, and had a somewhat explainable stupid loss. And I don't know how much you could say about everybody else on the list, because outside maybe, again, SMU or some of the G5 teams, there really isn't anybody else to slot in here at this point that's a P5 that has a strong argument.
Let's talk about a couple of teams that got left out. What I want to do is talk about one that's in the AP top 10 that we left out. We both left out. And I'm going to take that one. And then the next one, if you take away the AP top 10 teams that are Pac-12 Big Ten, the team that would slot up would be Auburn. So I'm going to take North Carolina and why I think that we didn't have them. And then I want you to take Auburn, a team that neither one of us ranked, that would be under our ranking scheme would be in the top 10. For me, North Carolina, I expected a lot from them this year. A lot of off-season hype, a lot of recruiting hype, a quarterback that's highly capable. And the formula to have an advantage in the COVID era is consistency carryover from personnel, both coaching and especially quarterback, skill positions, across the board. North Carolina's had a lot of that. They're 2-0. The game that got canceled was Charlotte, so it doesn't really matter. They're 2-0, but look, 26-22 against Boston College is not hugely impressive to me, especially since BC was coming off a 3-point win against Texas State. And Syracuse is bad, real bad. And North Carolina pulled away in the second half in that game, but Syracuse is real bad. I have not seen something from North Carolina that would tell me that they could definitely beat Oklahoma State or BYU. Possibly beat, but not definitely. One, tell me if you agree, and two, tell me why Auburn wasn't in your top 10.
I agree with that. And, we had North Carolina, I think, last week, and I kind of fell off. It That Boston College thing just scares me the more I look at it. I don't think Boston College is a great team. And they did outplay Boston College, but they've only played 2 games. The SEC teams have played 2 games, but almost universally have played better teams because Boston College and Syracuse probably would be the worst team in the SEC. Boston College would be competing for it. And North Carolina handled Syracuse well. That doesn't mean anything at all. And then Boston College didn't look good. Auburn, this one's kind of interesting to me that they're even ranked where they are at 13. And we talked about it. And this is the AP poll. If you took out the Big 12, the Big 10 and Pac-12 teams, they'd be a top 10 team in the AP. I just don't see it. We took flack in the comments section last week because they said, well, you guys rated Auburn fairly high. We were like, I think we had them like 5 or 6 or something like that. And then it's like, you rated them high and you crapped on them because we were negative. Look, I've been sketchy on Auburn all preseason. Their offensive line is all new. We knew that. We were kind of encouraged because they handled pretty well with Kentucky. They moved the ball pretty well offensively. Felt like maybe they were taking a step forward, and then defensively they looked fine. Held Kentucky pretty well pat, and then capitalized when Kentucky, finally made a mistake. What we saw in the Georgia game was, one, that offensive line that I was worried about may actually be bad. Two, we saw Kentucky play Ole Miss and found out Kentucky's not as good as they were supposed to be. So that's concerning with an Auburn data point. And then 3, we found out that Auburn's defense is not that good. And the front 7 kind of got pushed around by an offensive line that at Georgia is all new themselves, didn't look good against Arkansas, and that's sketchy. So there's really, quite frankly, not a lot about Auburn that gives me encouragement. I mean, the defense was supposed to be the rock of that team, and they didn't look great against Georgia. And there's nothing on offense that worries me if I'm an opponent. So, and this is the point that we were talking about that I made is Auburn's 13, Tennessee's 14, and LSU is 17 in the AP poll. I can't justify that. Tennessee hasn't lost and has looked better than Auburn. So I don't know why they're behind Auburn other than, confirmation bias of where Auburn was originally ranked. And LSU lost, yeah, but LSU looked maybe in some ways better in their loss than Auburn did against Georgia. May have been a worse team, but LSU was a heck of a lot more competitive. And then the other game, LSU looked way better against Vandy than Auburn looked against Kentucky. So I don't know why LSU is behind them. So Auburn is the one I really, probably the team more than any, that I don't get why they're ranked where they are currently.
Yeah, I always look at it like this. Like when an AP voter is filling out a ballot, and if somebody put a gun in their head and said, you got to get this right, are you really picking Auburn over Tennessee right now on a neutral field? Are you really picking Auburn over LSU right now on a neutral field? I could see it maybe with LSU. I don't know, but Tennessee I cannot. And again, like they might win, just like we picked Auburn to beat Georgia based on the information we had, but they didn't win, and now we have more information. So you need to adjust to the information you have. If Auburn went out and beat Tennessee tomorrow, it's not because of anything we've seen so far. And you can only rank based on what you've seen, and we haven't seen it. So I'm totally with you. Give me a parting shot on rankings, top 10 in general, and then we'll close this one out.
I think my parting shot would be, I expect this list to still get shaken up, and there's some stuff that's totally wrong now. If you looked in week 1 and you saw Arkansas play Georgia, there was nothing about, well, let's say Arkansas, Georgia, Mississippi State, and LSU, right? It's kind of a fun set of 4 teams that all are kind of getting flipped around. Nothing Georgia did against Arkansas justified Georgia coming out and thumping Auburn, because I don't think Arkansas is a better team than Auburn. I do not think Arkansas is a better team than Auburn. Georgia looked a lot better against Auburn than they did Arkansas. That's 2020 COVID. If you look at LSU in Arkansas, right? I mean, LSU got kind of taken to the woodshed defensively playing Mississippi State. Mississippi State turns around and can't score in Arkansas. And so one conclusion you could draw is that Arkansas is great on defense. Quite frankly, just straight up, I don't buy that. They're one of the least talented teams in the conference. They got some transfers. I do not buy that they've instantly turned around that much. I think it's far more likely that what you're seeing is ill-prepared teams that aren't gelling, stuff that's going wrong, lack of proper camp, guys missing from practice due to contact tracing, all coalescing in all these things. There is a crap ton we don't know about these teams. And just like me having A&M at 7, A&M is at 21st in the AP poll, behind LSU, behind Tennessee, behind Auburn. I don't know if that's too high or way too low. And are we way overreacting because A&M has lost one game to Alabama that most everyone's picking to play Clemson in the national title, or was before, at least before Ohio State comes back into the mix? I think these rankings are all going to be thrown out. I think, again, everybody in the SEC West but one team has already lost in just 2 games. People need to be real comfortable with like 3 and 4 lost teams being in the top 10, because it's going to happen this year. People are going to lose a lot. And especially with the conference schedule being the way it is, when the SEC teams playing 10 SEC games, they're going to lose more. And the SEC teams, every week they're going to go 500. One's going to win and one's going to lose on either side of that list. And with it being so unsteady with COVID, it's going to be a lot more random, and you're not going to have the clear top 5 teams and bottom 5 teams. It's going to be a lot more in the middle, which means a lot more middling records and a lot more losses. And all that is to say, that doesn't excuse Oklahoma and Texas, because, oh my gosh, Oklahoma's defense is bad, and Texas is just a poorly coached team.
It does make this kind of fun, though. I will say that, because it's not the same old. Maybe it is. I did tweet a couple weeks ago. I said it's going to be Alabama and Clemson again, isn't it? With a little bit of an eye roll. But everything else is crazy, and it's fun. All right, y'all. That's it for us in our top 10. Check out our other previews this week. We did Auburn and Tennessee. We did Texas A&M and Florida. And we did Miami and Clemson. Check them out. Let us know in the comments what you think the top 10 should be. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week. And God bless.